Well, for much of 2016, the talk about Vancouver and Toronto's housing market centered on how to cool them down. But 2017 could spark a different type of conversation. Many housing experts suggest markets across the country may slow down. Tom Davidoff is one of those experts. He is the director of the Centre for Urban Economics and Real Estate at the Sauder School of Business, and he joins us from Vancouver. Thank you, Tom, for being with us here today. And let's start with the West Coast. What is the housing outlook for 2017?
Well, I believe it's highly uncertain here in British Columbia, particularly Vancouver. We saw these astronomical price increases. Of course, home prices were expensive in 2015, but in some neighborhoods, prices rose by as much as 40%. Prices have ticked back down, especially at the high end. You know, the British Columbia province put in a 15% tax on foreign buyers, and that's cooled Vancouver and probably led a little bit of that foreign demand to some of the other markets around here, notably Victoria, Kelowna, and probably even over to Toronto. So we've seen transaction volumes slow since then. The federal government has cooled off the lower end of the market with their mortgage qualification rules. So particularly in BC, it's first-time buyers who have a harder time getting financed. And that can really lead to downward pressure at the lower end of the market. So with those two, plus the city of Vancouver imposing a new vacancy tax, I think a lot of forecasters are estimating negative price growth for the year here.
And you know, Tom, you did sort of touch on it there as well. But, you know, it might be a little bit early to tell. How might the BC government's, as you say, the new interest-free loan program for first-time home buyers impact that Vancouver market?
Yeah, that was a funny choice by the provincial government to sort of swim against the tide, especially of Ottawa. Ottawa's worried that first-time buyers are taking on too much debt, and that debt is both putting buyers and taxpayers at risk of default should prices fall or interest rates rise, but is also pushing home prices to unsustainable levels. Well, the British Columbia government decided to say, I think they're concerned about a price drop due to all the policies in effect, and they want to make sure prices don't fall too far. So they've sort of pushed in the other direction by offering interest-free, high loan-to-value loans, sort of like the stuff you saw in the States in the mid-2000s. And of course, that will probably act to attenuate some of the price decrease we're likely to see this year.
And now just moving a little bit further to the east here, what about energy-dependent regions? Is the outlook for the prairies, for example, any different?
Well, CMHC thinks those markets are at a bit of a risk of a downturn. Obviously, Calgary has been weak for some time, and Edmonton, due to the weakness of the oil sector. I would expect that to continue unless commodities turn around. I think some of the other parts of the prairie aren't so much overvalued in CMHC's view as potentially overbuilt, as probably there was a lot of construction during the commodities boom. So the middle, the prairie part of the country is looking at some risk.
And, you know, for years, many experts said Toronto was in a housing bubble, for example. Is that bubble still going to, and will it ever burst?
Well, you know, especially in a place like Vancouver, and to a lesser extent Toronto, where it's challenging to get stuff built. Of course, Toronto has the condos going up, but it's challenging to add single family. And in a market where it's hard to add supply, I'm reluctant to label things bubble. You know, we talk about it in Vancouver, Toronto, risk of a price drop. It's certainly there. But I think saying that the fundamentals don't support prices in Toronto, I'm not convinced of that. We've got very low interest rates and healthy income growth. So I don't think it's a certainty the market will turn down. But I think you do have a lot of supply coming on. You have the risk of interest rates continuing to rise, and you have federal policy trying to push down leverage. And I think all of that does put Toronto at risk of a correction for 2017.
And now to round out sort of this look across the country, too, what about the East Coast? What are the challenges in that part of the country when we're talking about real estate?
You know, maybe a bit of overvaluation. I think the issue when you go further east isn't so much that home prices are high, so much as a lot of the local economies aren't very strong. And when you have a weak economy, particularly unemployment, if that starts to tick up again, you get at risk of people not being able to make payments on homes. That doesn't support a high price level. And if things get bad enough, you can start to see some defaults or foreclosures.
Well, thank you again for joining us today, Tom, and Happy New Year. Tom Davidoff is the director of the Center for Urban Economics and Real Estate at the Sauder School of Business. He spoke to us from Vancouver.